So we dated. We double dated with Lou and Les Rawson. Lou was doll then, of course. They weren't married. We were still kids in high school. In fact, I think Lou and Les had just gotten married about the time Claude got back from his job. And I was working in the post office. So we ran around that winter. I taught school. The first year was probably 25, the fall of 25 and 26. I taught out in the Horning district. I didn't like to teach. I had no confidence. And I hadn't been in the grades for 6 years, and I had lost touch with how kids are and how the subject matter was. But I found out as soon as I would do my homework and make lesson plans in the evening, I liked it better. Then I didn't feel so helpless. Luckily, I had a good bunch of kids that first year. The next year, they asked me to take the Marston Moore School. Hugh Marston himself came and asked me to take the school, and I was flattered that he sought me out to teach their school. He said, "We'll give you $85 or $90 a month." I think I got 90. The first year I got $70 a month. But I went to the Marston Moore School and taught that winter. I left home that fall. I had an altercation with my dad, and I didn't feel I could stay home any longer. And anyway, I was grown up. I was 19 years old, probably. And so I stayed with friends in town and drove Claude's car back and forth to school until winter set in. I was also giving music lessons. So when winter set in, I asked if I could stay at Julius Larson's place, and that was Lester's folks and Milt's folks, whom we knew well. And they just had a little poor type of house and really no room to take in a teacher, but she kindly agreed to take me, and I slept with Irene, their only girl, and they would hitch up the horses and take the bunch of us to school. It was a big school, and I had 5 8th graders that had all flunked one subject the year before and were back in school to finish the 8th grade because they needed one subject. And of course, each of the 5 flunked a different subject. So my job was to teach 8th graders that one subject and have enough classes for them so that I could get them through, or they could get themselves through. It was a pretty hopeless job. Luckily, the kids were pretty bright, all except one of them, who I'm sure had a learning disability, and she had flunked history. The only way she could recite on anything in history was to memorize one paragraph, which she did each day. Memorized one paragraph out of her lesson, and she gave that by rote and had no idea what the answers to the other questions were. So we had to give her a little push and a little help to get her through the 8th grade. I had no conscience about helping her to get through, because there was no way that girl would ever teach or use her education in any way that would be a misrepresentation of her ability. And that was the way it turned out. She never had a job. She always stayed home until her folks died, and was never able to cope out in society. In addition to these 5 8th graders that had all flunked one subject, I had 2 1st graders that were not very bright, not very good students, both of them boys. I began to wonder if I didn't know how to teach first graders or if it was that they were just absolutely dull. So about 6 weeks after school started, a new family moved into the district with 6 children in school. One of them was a first grader that didn't speak English, a little girl. I figuratively threw up my hands and said, I cannot promise to get that child through the first grade. 6 weeks late, she doesn't speak English. I can't possibly find any extra time to give her. I'll have to let her get what she can glean by herself. So that's the premise I operated on, and proceeded with educating these 2 little rascal boys. And when spring came, the little girl knew as much as both of them put together and spoke English besides, and she had picked it all up without any concentration on her. It was a nice family, but it was a difficult year, and the snow was deep. And I didn't see Claude all winter. And they did have a phone. I could call once in a while if I could get to a phone. And towards spring, I agreed to drive. I had his car. I certainly wasn't driving it in the winter because the snow was very deep. I don't remember where I had it. But I was going to drive out there and pick him up, and we were going to a dance, and we had agreed on that. So I was looking forward to it. And so I drove out there after school, eager to see him. And when I got there, he looked like he hadn't brushed his teeth all winter. And he had his collar turned up, and he needed a haircut, and he looked awful. And he didn't even seem to be aware that I was coming. But he managed to clean himself up and get ready, and we went to the dance. I don't remember anything about the dance, but I remember the impact of seeing him. And I should have seen the handwriting on the wall then that he was slipping. But anyway, this was towards spring, and we planned to get married in June. And I saw him several times, of course, between then at that time and when we got together to get married. And it did worry me a little bit. I had never seen any mental illness, and I had no idea what it was. I just had an uneasy feeling about it. And I did want to get married. I didn't enjoy teaching school. I didn't enjoy taking care of myself. I'd like to keep house. I liked to sew, to make curtains and bedspreads, and to embroidery, to raise children, to sew for them. And that was my idea of the life that I wanted. I wanted to get married. And so, with some apprehension, I agreed to get married. And so we got married, and we went on the trip. And we had only been home a while. It was getting into haying season. We were living in half of Grandma and Grandpa's house on the farm. And I had the door open. It was summertime. And I heard cursing and swearing out under the clotheslines. And here it was Claude, yelling and acting wholly irresponsible. And I thought, my God, what have I gotten into? I'd only been married a month, probably. And there was quite a lot of that through the years. It was an embarrassment to me. And I had him to psychiatrists, to doctors. He went to Rochester and went through the clinic in Rochester. They didn't find anything. They didn't report anything. I didn't go with him. I probably should have, so that I could have talked to them. But it was more expensive than we could afford to have just him go. He also went through the clinic in Bismarck, and they found nothing. I had taken psychology from a psychologist in Valley City, and he had been giving hypnosis to people who couldn't sleep. Well, Claude had a terrible sleeping problem, especially after we moved to Pettibone. And he couldn't sleep nights, and he walked the floor. And if I had just mopped the floor or even just varnished the rug, there was no way he would stay off the floor. I'd say, "No, Claude, don't walk on this floor. It's got wet varnish on it." And in 5 minutes, he'd be walking across it. He couldn't seem to keep it in his mind. And no one that I had him to could ever put their finger on his problem. And sometimes they were serious, sometimes better, sometimes he acted almost normal. And I thought, this is the way it should be. And why isn't it always? Bonnie called up the powers that be at the state hospital when he was in there for about 3 weeks, I believe it was, taking shock treatments. And they told her that he had severe depression. So the problem was never resolved. Sometimes it was better, sometimes it was worse, but it was always there. And I still don't know. I read a long article on being neurotic, and there were so many things that fit him that I thought that had to be the name of it. But he never used it as an excuse to not work. Never did he say, "I'm so sick I'm not going to go to work today," and hide in the corner or anything like that. He got up and he delivered his gas, and I don't think he ever made a serious mistake in it. If he did, I didn't hear about it, and I probably wouldn't have. So a few years before he retired, he was very, very bad with it. He wasn't sleeping nights. He was walking the floor. He was difficult to get along with. And I think the most annoying thing was that he would shout around. And he was a man that hated profanity, but he used a lot of it at times like that. And of course, I prayed a lot about it. I got everything I could get a hold of to read. I asked doctors about him. Nobody seemed to have any answers. So that was my cross. And also his, of course. And I would say to him sometimes when we got down there at the end of the trip, "Oh, it's so good to be home. Isn't it wonderful to be home?" And he wouldn't say it was. But when he had to go to the nursing home, because I just absolutely couldn't hold him up, because he had to have a nurse on each side to hold him up because he couldn't walk that last time. And there wasn't anything in the world he wanted but to go home. He said, hire somebody to wash the dishes and you just take care of me. Well, it couldn't be done. I couldn't handle him alone. I couldn't be on call 24 hours a day. And if I had had him home and hired a nurse around the clock, it would be just as expensive as putting him in a nursing home where they had the proper equipment. So I think it was about 79 that Dr. Pedersen from Jamestown detected some failure in his blood system. And he wrote us after we had gone to Arizona for the winter and said that they had been watching it for a few years and that it seemed to be steadily going down. And he thought it was time to see a blood specialist, which we did. And he said, yes, he did. He had aplastic anemia. And that the bone marrow was making red blood cells, all right, but not making them in the proper quality or quantity that was necessary to sustain his life. So he started having blood transfusions. I think it was 4 years that he kept increasingly having transfusions until he was having them every 2.5 weeks toward the end. He had his last blood transfusion from the nursing home on my birthday, the 27th of January. He was ill and he was irrational. And he was sitting in his chair and he kept pulling the tubes off from his arms while he was getting the transfusion. So they put a piece of supporting plastic under his arm. And he was sitting there and the phone rang in the office. He was taking it in the office. And he lifted up this board and held it up to his ear and said, hello, hello. And I said, Claude, what are you doing? Well, he said, I have to answer the phone. He lived just a week after that blood transfusion. He went steadily downhill. And he died the 2nd or 3rd of February. He had a lot of pain in his feet from arthritis. And it worried him a lot. And he would say every once in a while, oh, I hope they don't cut my legs off. And I said, there isn't any reason to think that they might. That isn't where your problem is. And I couldn't help thinking when I saw him right after he died. He had beautiful little straight feet. And there were his feet intact, and he had no earthly use for them. He was a great worrier, and he worried about everything, and always assumed that the worst was going to happen. And I think he was his own worst enemy. I think that gives you a pretty good thumbnail sketch of what Claude's middle years were like.
He worked for Standard Oil?
Yes.
For like 30?
Well, I thought it was 33 years. I think Wally says it's 31, 32. In there someplace. I think it was 31 that he took the job, and it was right after the first of the year. I think it was probably in the end of January or early in February.
Did he like working for them?
Yes, he was very proud of his company, and he thought a lot of them.